This video will contain spoilers from the off, so remember, you've been warned. Black Mirror is now an extremely large universe, 28 episodes in total. It's grown a lot since it first hit screens back in 2011, and it's great to see it develop. With the universe getting so large and it never really being documented if it's in one reality, what the specific timeline is, and if it's all set in the same space, I thought I'd have a go at piecing together a timeline of the episodes of Black Mirror and pinpoint the rough dates that I feel each episode is set whilst also having evidence to back up its placement. I'll aim to provide a linear time period from when technology and society started changing with each new invention and how it's all interconnected. So let's get into it. Here is the Black Mirror timeline explained. So the earliest point in Black Mirror is the episode Beyond the Sea. This episode was set in 1969 and paints a picture of the world that was there. We saw the likes of Chitty Chitty Bang Bang being played in the theatres, and other movies from the time as well. So although it could well be an alternative 1969 due to the advancement of technology, it's 1969 nonetheless. After that, there was a gap in the time period for around 10 years, and there were no real advancements until 1979, and that is when On Earth, the episode Demon 79 occurred. We know that it is the time period due to it being in the episode title, but also the car tax on the window. Then in the same country, 5 years later, in 1984, the episode Bandersnatch happened. We know this episode was set in 1984 due to it being told to us a number of times during the interactive special. Maisie Day is then next in terms of the timeline, and it came a long way after Bandersnatch. It appeared in 2006. This is known due to the technology that was around during the episode, such as the iPod Shuffle and also the fact that the character had to dial up to the internet. Plus, there was also a newspaper that was present with the date on it. Shortly after this, I would predict in around 2008, that was when White Bear happened. There's not much to go off with this, but when looking at the type of devices that the people in the Justice Park were using, such as phones like the BlackBerry Curve, which came out in 2007, I imagine this could have been in the year that followed. This episode deliberately had no dates mentioned on the calendar due to it portraying the same day every day, but I think it was around 2008. Next in the timeline, I would predict that it would be the national anthem. I feel this would be around 4 years later in about 2011. With there being an actual general election in 2010, I feel Michael Callow would have come into power then, and would now be within his first term and not new to the game, so to speak. So I feel it would have been around a year or so after he was elected that the pig incident happened. 2012 is next on the timeline, and that's when I believe the Waldo Moment happened. We must remember this was for a local election, which meant that Michael Callow was still in power. Local elections work at a slightly different time frame to general elections. Judging by the technology that was present and the type of iPhone and iOS system that was being used, the Waldo Moment most probably falls around this time period. In 2013, that's where I feel 15 million merits is set. This would have been at the height of TV competition shows taking place and people being exploited and losing all integrity for a piece of fame. And I think in terms of the Black Mirror world, it would have been taking place around then too. The technology was advanced in the episode, but not super advanced. After 15 million merits in the timeline is Playtest. Playtest strikes me as an episode that was set in around 2014 and would have followed on 2 years later from the Waldo Moment. The way that Cooper was playing games on his phone was a very mid-2010s thing, and something that happened during the early days of smartphones. I also think that the game that he partook in was the first type of technology of its kind, and the fact that they were testing it out in the episode proves that. With us seeing a more advanced version of this tech that is slightly different later on down the line with the likes of USS Callister, I feel this was definitely earlier on in the timeline. The next inclusion is Shut Up and Dance. This was an episode that felt as though it took place in the modern day at the time of release. There was no fancy technology that was present, it was just everything that we had in 2016, so I think it's quite safe to pinpoint that specific spot in the timeline. 2 years later in 2018 is where I feel the entire history of You is set and would come next on the timeline. It would mark the first piece of technology that truly hit society with impact and was the first iteration of it. Or my alternative placement for this episode would be so far in the future, post-Metalhead, after a rebuild of society, due to the way that it was structured and the fact that the number plates on the vehicles looked drastically different to anything that we'd ever seen in the show before. Then in 2019 is San Junipero. I say this because it had to be before 2022, as a filmmaker was nominated for a BAFTA in that year for a documentary that they created on San Junipero. I imagine they made the documentary upon it being quite fresh in the public, almost like this groundbreaking new thing, and they wanted to show people what went on exactly. So I would say that taking into consideration the filmmaking process, release and nomination, it was probably around 2019. Shortly after this episode is when I feel as though Hated in the Nation would be said. Within the episode, it's mentioned that Mass was going to be introduced and rolled out to the public. With Men Against Fire coming shortly after this, it would have to sit around there. An episode that I feel is set in the year 2020 is Smithereens, judging by the number plate of the police car, with it being a 60 plate which made it a 2020 model. This to me is the clearest indicator of the time period. However, with the likes of Saito Gamo trending on Twitter announcing a new game, it does make me think that they finally nailed the game that they tested on Cooper and were preparing it for release, showing that this is further ahead than playtest. Ashley O was also still active at that point as well, as she was trending. And also it confirmed that Michael Callow was still Prime Minister, maybe towards the end of his second term. 2020 is a year where I also feel as though there was a lot of groundbreaking technology in the world of Black Mirror. Eyewear was the thing that all of the technology companies were focusing on, and I feel that's where White Christmas and also Men Against Fire was set. Two technologies that focused on being able to utilize the eyes. Live streaming with the eyes, recording with the eyes, and also being able to block. It was a more developed version of what we saw in the entire history of You. However, Men Against Fire could have utilized a slightly more advanced version due to the fact that it was for the military. The technology that was focused on the eyes in White Christmas was far more advanced than the entire history of You. After this in the timeline, we'd most likely have 2022, where I feel Lock Henry would be said. When looking at the type of devices that they had, the registration on the van that they had for hire, which was a 60 plate, which meant that it was at least 2020, I feel this was an episode that was set in the present day upon release, so I'm going to say 2022. Plus, with the Callow years being a documentary that was already created, it would have to be post-2020 when I feel as though Callow was no longer in power. Next in the timeline is 2023, and that's where I think Joan is Awful is. One good thing about Joan is Awful is that it gives a ton of clues about everything that came before it, such as Lock Henry, Hotshots, the specific season that we saw in 15 Million Merits, Junipero Dreaming, and Rachel, Jack and Ashley too. One thing that is interesting is that Yorkie's coffee shop is still around from 2008. At the same time, this is where I would place Nosedive. Why? Well, there was a message on the social media app Smithereens from Lacey Pound in the episode Joan is Awful, and it looked as though she was still caring about what people thought of her, due to the type of messages that she was putting out there, so it was before she stopped caring about who she was. However, I would say that this is almost set in a completely different location, as society was so different. A couple of years later, that's where I feel Crocodile came into the picture. I know it would be easy to think, oh, but the grain basically allowed you to see your memories. However, with Crocodile, it was a different piece of tech. A piece of tech that allowed memories to be played back in real time from other people, not stored, and they were undeletable. Something which I think would become a mandatory part of policing in the future. I imagine the tech had been around for a while, and it had, as the development of a memory device was mentioned in Bandersnatch. But due to the questions around the morality of it, it would have most likely taken a lot of time to get passed through due to the red tape that was involved. Despite Archangel feeling like a slightly different society, I would say that this piece of tech and the episode is set shortly after Crocodile. We know that it's after Men Against Fire due to the fact that when the test footage was being looked at, they used the actual iCam footage from the specific episode with Stripe, so we know that it's definitely past that point. As well, the interface is relatively similar to the grain, so with it being a new product, it could be piggybacking off of the original tech, which was the grain. After this, several years later, that's when USS Callister would be around. This episode had gaming on another level, far more advanced than what we previously saw in playtest. This was entertainment that allowed you to transport into a different world, utilize DNA to create characters from people that you knew, whilst they were also sentient beings. Shortly after USS Callister, I would say that Black Museum falls into the timeline. Why? Because, well, everything that we've seen in Black Mirror is pretty much stored in the museum. The bathtub from Crocodile, the story of Victoria Scillane, the Archangel tablet, the lollipop from USS Callister, so many different things. So this is an episode that would be extremely far along in the timeline. After Black Museum, that's where I believe the episode Striking Vipers would sit. Well, in USS Callister, the technology was pitched as groundbreaking in the gaming world, allowing you to fully immerse yourself. Plus, it also seemed like many people had to go to the HQ to be able to play it, due to it being at early stages. This, however, utilized extremely similar technology that allowed you to enter a game and be fully immersed, but from the comfort of your own home. After this would come Rachel, Jack and Ashley 2. This is because in the Rachel, Jack and Ashley 2 episode, we saw that Rolo Haynes was found in the burning museum, and we also saw that Striking Vipers was in existence on the news. So she was still active as those incidents happened. With Smithereens being in 2020, it showed that it must have been one of her earlier shows. Following on from this episode would be Be Right Back. I think this would follow on a couple of years after Archangel, and after other tech like the Grain had their systems up and running. This is advanced tech, possibly some of the most advanced in the entirety of the show. There were social media platforms that we hadn't seen before, there were unfamiliar devices and software that was very different. Also, the ability to create somebody based off of their online activity was so far advanced. A physical being that resembled somebody had never been heard of in the show before, so I think it would sit at around this place in the timeline. At around the same time, I would also say that Hang the DJ was also set. It's an interesting one, as it could be the present day. However, I would say that it was slightly in the future, with an extremely developed app that allowed users to play out scenarios inside of the app based on their matches. It's something that was never seen during any other episode. Plus, I would say that the devices that were used and the operating system was relatively similar to Be Right Back. The final inclusion in the timeline, in my opinion, is Metalhead. I think this would be set in around the year 2100. The world was pretty much destroyed by the technology that humankind created, and it was almost like a barren wasteland. None of the technology that we came to see in the show would have been able to function as easily post this time period. So civilization falling to its knees due to the metal dogs is something that I think comes last. This is not necessarily definitive, but it's the order that I think best explains the linear progression of time within the Black Mirror universe. Do you think it's pretty similar? Let me know. So, there you have it, the Black Mirror timeline explained. If you want to see more videos such as endings explained, theories and predictions and character breakdowns, then click on the I button. Or alternatively, you can head over to my channel where you'll find them all. If you'd like to give me a show or movie that you'd like me to review, then head over to my Twitter, @BrainPilot_, and tweet me what show or movie you'd like me to review next. And finally, if you'd like to see what I rate the latest movies that don't quite make the cut to getting a dedicated video, then head over to my Letterboxd profile. It's where I rate the latest releases in real time. What's your favourite episode of Black Mirror? Leave a comment down below, and don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you next time.